4:15 in the morning. Forward Operating Base Patriot in southeastern Poland. The radar operators of the 10th Army Air and Missile Defense Command were not looking at a routine training exercise. They were staring at 6 ballistic tracks that should not have existed. Within 45 seconds, the question of whether this was a malfunction or a calculated act of war would be answered in fire and the screaming of sirens. The Polish air was bone-chillingly cold, smelling of damp pine needles and the faint, metallic scent of the heavy machinery that had sat dormant for weeks. A thin layer of frost covered the canvas of the command tents, glistening under the artificial hum of the perimeter lights. For 3 decades, this ground had been the frontier of a cold peace, a line on a map that both sides promised never to cross. Tonight, that promise was evaporating at 6 times the speed of sound. The Arch of Conflict. 150 kilometers to the east, across the border in the Brest region, the foreign military ballistic missile battery had already completed its cycle. The heavy 4-axle TEL vehicles, the transporter erector launchers, sat in the deep shadows of a deciduous forest, their massive heat signatures masked by the dense canopy. To the foreign crews, this was not an act of emotion, but a mathematical solution to a geopolitical problem. The coordinates had been hard-coded into the guidance systems months ago: 50 degrees north, 22 degrees east. The launch had been a singular, violent event. The missiles had erupted from their canisters with a bone-shaking roar, trailing pillars of white-hot exhaust that illuminated the forest for miles. Now, those 6 missiles were in their terminal phase, arcing through the thin atmosphere before plunging back toward the Earth. They were no longer just weapons. They were the physical manifestation of a decade of failed diplomacy, broken treaties, and the deep, historical fear of encirclement that had gripped the foreign military for generations. At Forward Operating Base Patriot, the silence of the morning was shattered by the incoming alarm, a low, rhythmic pulse that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of the soldiers' bones. Men and women scrambled from their cots, boots unlaced, hearts hammering against ribs. The air was suddenly thick with the smell of ozone and the high-pitched whine of the MIM-104 Patriot missile batteries swinging their square launchers toward the eastern horizon. The collision of superpowers. Inside the engagement control station, the atmosphere was a pressurized vacuum of professional focus. Tracks 5 through 10 confirmed ballistic. The tactical control officer shouted over the hum of the cooling fans, engaging with ripples of 2. Birds away. From the edge of the base, 4 Patriot interceptors climbed into the dark sky, their rocket motors carving jagged lines of orange fire through the clouds. The interceptors moved with a predatory grace, searching for the Iskander warheads that were now performing erratic, high-G evasive maneuvers designed specifically to defeat defense systems. The first interception happened at an altitude of 12,000 meters. A flash of white light bleached the sky, followed seconds later by a rolling boom that sounded like the Earth itself was cracking open. One ballistic warhead vanished, turned into a cloud of glowing titanium confetti. A second followed moments later, the debris raining down over the empty farmland. But the mathematics of the saturation strike were cold and unforgiving. The 4th and 5th ballistic missiles utilized their onboard electronic countermeasures, blinding the local radar for a fraction of a heartbeat. It was enough. The final 2 missiles plummeted through the defensive screen, their solid fuel motors long since spent, falling as heavy, kinetic hammers aimed at the heart of the military presence. The shattering of the peace. The impact was not a single sound, but a sequence of physical shocks that redefined the reality of everyone on the base. The first warhead struck the fuel depot on the western perimeter. 500,000 liters of JP-8 aviation fuel ignited instantly, creating a fireball that rose 300 meters into the air, turning the pre-dawn darkness into a sickly, artificial noon. The shockwave stripped the canvas from every tent within a 400-meter radius and threw heavy transport trucks into the air like children's toys. The second warhead struck the main communications hub. The reinforced concrete structure, designed to withstand heavy artillery, buckled under the kinetic energy of a 1,000-kilogram payload traveling at Mach 6. The ground beneath the base heaved, a man-made earthquake that severed power lines and ruptured water mains. As the echoes of the twin detonations rolled across the Polish countryside, a new and terrible silence fell over Forward Operating Base Patriot. It was the silence of a world that had just changed forever. The black smoke from the burning fuel depot drifted toward the east, a dark shroud over a landscape where the rules of the last 80 years no longer applied. Two superpowers had finally stopped talking. Now, the iron had begun to speak. The decision to launch the 6 Iskander-M ballistic missiles had not been made in the heat of a battlefield moment, but in the sterile, high-ceilinged silence of the Kremlin's Situation Room 72 hours earlier. For 20 years, the geopolitical tectonic plates of Eastern Europe had been grinding against one another with increasing pressure. And on this cold morning in 2026, the crust of diplomacy finally shattered. The red line that Moscow had drawn across the map of the Polish plains, a line intended to halt the eastward. Expansion of NATO influence was no longer a metaphor. It was now a scorched trench filled with the wreckage of American equipment. History would point to the 12th of March as the beginning of the end of the long peace, the day the Suwalki Protocol collapsed under the weight of mutual suspicion. The protocol had been a fragile agreement designed to ensure civilian transit between mainland Russia and the heavily militarized exclave of Kaliningrad, but a series of disputed border inspections by Polish authorities had provided the spark. To the west, it was a matter of sovereign security. To the east, it was a deliberate strangulation of Russian territory that could only be answered with the cold logic of kinetic force. The mobilization of the ghosts. While the diplomats in Brussels and Washington were still drafting memos of concern, the Russian 11th Army Corps was already in motion, emerging from their barracks like ghosts from a winter fog. Tens of thousands of infantrymen, supported by 800 T-90M tanks and 300 BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, began a massive readiness exercise that spanned the entire border of the Suwalki Gap. The action was not merely a show of force, but a deliberate blinding of Western intelligence through a coordinated campaign of electronic warfare and cyber-sabotage. In the 48 hours leading up to the strike on Forward Operating Base Patriot, the digital infrastructure of Warsaw had begun to flicker and die. The power grid succumbed to a sophisticated malware strain that left 3 million people in darkness, while the military's encrypted satellite links were saturated with white noise. American commanders, 4:45 in the morning. Forward Operating Base Patriot was no longer a structured military installation. It was a jagged, blackened wound in the Polish earth. The 2 Iskander-M warheads had done more than destroy buildings. They had shattered the delicate machinery of command and control that allowed 3,000 soldiers to function as a single organism. The air was a suffocating cocktail of freezing winter oxygen and the blistering chemical heat of 500,000 liters of burning JP-8 aviation fuel. The smell was unforgettable. The sharp, metallic tang of vaporized aluminum mixed with the heavy, sweet scent of scorched earth and the copper bite of blood. To the survivors crawling from the ruins of their barracks, the world had been reduced to a narrow radius of flickering orange light and the deafening, secondary roars of ammunition cook-offs. The anatomy of chaos. In the center of the base, Brigadier General Marcus Thorne stood outside, the collapsed remains of the Tactical Operations Center, his face dusted with white concrete powder and a single streak of dark crimson running from his hairline. He was a man who had spent 30 years preparing for a high-intensity conflict with a peer adversary. Yet the sheer physical reality of the devastation left him momentarily paralyzed. To his left, a line of 3 military helicopters sat on the flight line, their rotors twisted into grotesque, skeletal shapes by the initial blast wave. To his right, the main medical station was a hive of frantic, desperate activity, where medics worked under the strobing light of burning Humvees to stabilize men whose eardrums had been ruptured by the overpressure of the Mach 6 impact. The golden hour, that critical 60-minute window to save the critically wounded, was ticking away, but there was nowhere to send the casualties. The roads leading west toward Rzeszów were rumored to be cratered by follow-on strikes. And, The air was thick with the invisible signatures of foreign electronic warfare units that had turned every radio frequency into a wall of static. 6 in the morning. The North Atlantic Council headquarters in Brussels, and the underground bunkers of the Pentagon. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization had existed for 77 years as a grand architectural promise of collective security. A shield forged in the aftermath of a global cataclysm, but within 90 minutes of the strike on Rzeszów, that promise was being translated into the terrifying language of Article 5. The decision-makers sat in rooms where the air was filtered and recycled, smelling faintly of ozone and expensive electronics, while they watched the digital representation of a continent sliding toward an abyss, from which there might be no return. Across the Atlantic, the military machine was performing a violent, synchronized awakening as the gears of the National Command Authority ground together to initiate the most complex deployment of force in human history. This was no longer about the strategic ambiguity of the previous decades. It was the raw, unvarnished activation of a war plan that had been refined in darkness for generations, a plan that assumed the total mobilization of the United States' industrial and kinetic might, the mobilization of the Fifth Corps. In the muddy, rain-swept fields of western Poland and eastern Germany, the United States Fifth Corps was already breaking cover, their heavy armored columns emerging from camouflaged motor pools like steel leviathans rising from a deep and troubled sea. The air in these staging areas was thick with the suffocating stench of diesel exhaust and the heavy, wet smell of churned earth as 80-ton M1A2 SEP V3 Abrams tanks clattered onto the asphalt of the A2 motorway. The soldiers of the 1st Armored Division, their faces illuminated by the green glow of tactical tablets, understood with a heavy, cold certainty that they were the primary target of the next wave of Russian long-range precision strikes. They moved with a desperate, practiced efficiency, knowing that every minute spent idling in a column was a minute where a foreign satellite or a high-altitude drone could lock their coordinates into a firing solution. The sounds of the mobilization were a discordant symphony of grinding gears, the high-pitched whistle of turbine engines, and the rhythmic shouting of non-commissioned officers, who had traded their peacetime personas for the grim, clipped tones of men leading others toward a meat grinder. The Polish spring rain fell in a steady, relentless drizzle, soaking into the Gore-Tex jackets and the heavy wool blankets of the infantry, a cold reminder that the environment was a neutral enemy that would claim as many lives as the shrapnel and the fire. The escalation ladder. At the strategic level, the conflict was being viewed through the lens of the escalation ladder, a theoretical framework where each side climbed higher, toward total nuclear exchange with every passing hour of conventional combat. The deployment of the Fifth Corps was a necessary rung on that ladder, a physical demonstration of American resolve that carried the inherent risk of triggering a preemptive tactical nuclear strike from a Russian military that viewed its own survival as being at stake. Inside the command bunkers, the generals debated the air-land battle doctrine with a renewed, feverish intensity, calculating the exact number of F-35 Bravo sorties required to suppress the Russian S-400 surface-to-air missile systems that now created a lethal canopy over the entire border region. The mathematics of the engagement were staggering. They were projecting a loss rate of 15% for the first 24 hours of air operations, a number that would have been unthinkable in any conflict of the last 40 years. The geopolitical context was a suffocating weight on the shoulders of every officer in the room, as reports began to filter in of Chinese naval movements in the Pacific and Iranian missile alerts in the Persian Gulf. The Iron Horizon was not just a Polish problem, it was a global fracture, a moment where the interconnected world of commerce and digital exchange was being torn apart by the primitive, territorial hunger of a land-based superpower. The weight of the watch. As the sun struggled to rise through a thick, overcast sky that was the color of bruised lead, the lead elements of the 2nd Cavalry Regiment crossed the Vistula River, their striker vehicles kicking up plumes of gray spray as they raced toward the sounds of the distant artillery. The landscape they passed through was one of eerie, haunting beauty, quaint Polish villages where the lights were still off, and ancient forests that had seen a dozen armies pass through them over the last millennium. The soldiers inside the vehicles sat in a heavy, contemplative silence, their gloved hands gripping their M4 carbines with a white-knuckled intensity that betrayed the terror they were forbidden to speak aloud. They were the tip of the spear, the human cost of a grand strategy that was being decided in rooms thousands of miles away by men who would never feel the vibration of an incoming shell or the bite of the freezing rain. The transition from peace to war was now complete. The machinery of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization was no longer a deterrent, but a weapon in full recoil. The world watched, breathless and terrified, as the two greatest military powers on the planet prepared to collide, in a test of steel and will that would either forge a new order or leave the world a smoldering, silent ruin. 6:20 in the morning. A dense, ancient pine forest, 20 kilometers north of Brest, Belarus. The Russian 9K-720 Iskander-M battery sat in a cathedral of frozen timber, shielded from the sky by layers of multispectral camouflage netting that mimicked the thermal signature of the forest floor. To the four-man crew of the lead transporter Erector launcher, the war was a series of glowing green coordinates on a ruggedized laptop and the rhythmic thrum of a diesel generator. They were the architects of the Arzesho strike, yet they had seen nothing of the fire they had unleashed. They existed in a bubble of cold air, smelling of unwashed wool, stale coffee, and the sharp, chemical tang of hydraulic fluid. Their reality was about to be reconfigured by a weapon they could neither hear nor see. High above the overcast ceiling, at an altitude of 35,000 feet, a lone F-35 Bravo Lightning II moved through the thin air like a ghost. The pilot, a 32-year-old major from Ohio, was not looking through a canopy, but through a distributed aperture system that projected a spherical view of the world directly onto his helmet visor. He was the silent reaper of the fifth generation, and he had just found the heat signature of a cooling exhaust pipe through a gap in the Belarusian pines. In the world of Style A3 war literature, the individual is often a spectator to the vast, grinding machinery of state-level violence. The Russian crew believed in their concealment, anchored by the nearby presence of an S-400 surface-to-air missile system that promised an iron dome over their sector. But the friction of war is an unpredictable force. A single Orlan 10 drone, damaged by electronic interference, had spiraled out of control and crashed 3 kilometers away, drawing a United States Special Operations team toward the area. The coordinates had been whispered into the satellite net 5 minutes ago. The forest was eerily still, the only sound the occasional snap of a frozen branch under the weight of the late-season snow. The Russian battery commander, a man named Captain Volkov, stepped out of the command vehicle to smoke a cigarette. He looked at the massive missile canisters tilted toward the sky and felt a fleeting, hollow sense of pride. He did not know that at that exact moment, 2,000 pounds of precision-guided high explosives were already falling through the clouds at transonic speeds. "39 small-diameter bombs. The sleek weapons unfolding their wings to glide toward the target. The trigger was squeezed in a cockpit miles away. The bombs shrieked through the lower atmosphere, their internal GPS guidance systems locked onto the infrared strobe of the Special Forces laser designator. The first warhead punched straight through the triple-layered camouflage netting and drove into the center of the transporter vehicle, detonating with a focused, white-hot intensity. The shock waves stripped the bark from every tree within 50 meters and compressed the air with such violence that the windows of the nearby command van shattered into a million diamond-like shards. A second later, the remaining solid fuel propellant in the second Iskander missile ignited. The vehicle erupted into a vertical pillar of fire that reached 1,000 degrees in seconds. The 6-ton missile canister was blasted off its mounts and sent flying through the air, crushing a BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicle that had been parked 20 meters away. The armor of the BMP split open like a tin can, and the secondary detonation of its 30mm ammunition created a localized storm of shrapnel that shredded the surrounding forest. The Russian defenders reacted in a blind, visceral panic. Survivors stumbled from the burning wreckage, their uniforms smoldering, their lungs scorched by the chemical bite of the propellant. A machine gunner on a nearby perimeter post opened fire into the chemical, dark woods, the red tracers cutting uselessly through the smoke, while the remaining launch vehicles attempted to reverse out of the flaming clearing. One TEL driver, blinded by the soot, slammed his massive 8-wheeled truck into a stand of ancient oaks, the axle snapping with a sound like a gunshot. Black, oily smoke rose from the furnace that had once been a high-tech launch site. The clearing was now a graveyard of blackened steel and twisted aluminum, where the only sound was the rhythmic hiss of ruptured pressurized lines and the distant, fading whine of the Sidon-Say's jet engine high above. The forest, which had stood for centuries, was now a jagged landscape of charcoal and ash. The destruction of the battery was a tactical victory, but in the context of a superpower war, it was a drop of water in a boiling ocean. For every Iskander launcher destroyed, another 3 were being moved into position along the 1,000-mile front. The F-35 Bravo banked hard to the west, its internal fuel stores running low, leaving behind a beacon of fire that could be seen by Russian satellites hundreds of miles above. The iron horizon was now defined by these flickering points of light, small, violent deaths occurring in the dark corners of Europe. Volkov, lying in the snow with his eardrums shattered, looked up at the gray sky and saw nothing but the indifferent clouds. He realized then that the war had no face. It was a collision of systems, a mathematical exchange where human lives were merely the remainders in a long and bloody division. The silence returned to the forest, but it was a heavy, suffocating silence that tasted of copper and cold. 6:15 in the morning. The thin, freezing stratosphere over the Polish-Belarusian border. The E-3 Charlie Hawkeye AWACS aircraft was banking slowly at 30,000 feet, its massive rotating radar dome scanning 1,000 square kilometers of hostile airspace. Inside the pressurized cabin, the air smelled of recycled oxygen and the sharp, metallic tang of overheated electronics. For the 22 crew members on board, the war was not a mess of mud and fire, but a geometric abstraction of green and blue icons dancing across high-resolution displays. This morning, however, the geometry was failing. The Russian electronic warfare units, the Krashuka 4 systems hidden in the forests below, were flooding the sky with high-powered microwave interference. On the radar screens, the clear map of Eastern Europe was dissolving into a shimmering wall of digital noise, a snowstorm of false targets and ghost signatures that made it impossible to distinguish a flight of Russian Su-35 fighters from a flock of migratory birds. The invisible architecture of the sky. The air war over Poland had become a contest of invisible architectures. On one side stood the military fifth-generation stealth doctrine, represented by the F-35 Bravo Lightning II. On the other was the foreign A2AD anti-access and area denial, anchored by the S-400 Triumph surface-to-air missile system. This was not the dogfighting of the prize, 20th century. It was a cold, clinical exchange of sensor data and long-range kinetic energy, where the first pilot to turn on, their radar became a beacon for a dozen incoming missiles. 12,000 meters below the E-3 Charlie, a flight of 4 F-35 fighters moved in a wide, staggered formation. They were running passive, their own radars silent, receiving targeting data from the AWACS via encrypted bursts of light. The pilots sat in a cocoon of carbon fiber and glass, their hearts slowed by the rhythmic hiss of their breathing apparatus. To them, the iron horizon was a vertical wall of lethal probabilities. If they flew too high, the S-400 radars would eventually 7:15 in the morning. The Baltic Sea. 40 miles off the coast of the Kaliningrad exclave. The destroyer, USS Mason, was no longer a silent observer of the gray, choppy waters. It had become a localized center of atmospheric violence. The ship's hull groaned under the sudden, immense pressure of its own transition from a state of watchful waiting to one of active, lethal retaliation. For the sailors in the Combat Information Center, The world was a high-resolution nightmare of blue icons and incoming telemetry, but for those on the deck, the war was a visceral assault on the senses. The air was heavy with the smell of salt and the cold, biting spray of the Baltic, but that natural scent was suddenly obliterated by the acrid, chemical stench of rocket propellant. This was the military answer to a forward military airbase, a calculated, multi-axis strike intended to blind the foreign military integrated air defense network. It was a move on a global chessboard where every piece was made of high explosives and every square was a sovereign border. The decision to strike targets inside the Foreign Military Federation's recognized territory was a crossing of a Rubicon that the world had prayed would remain dry, yet here, in the cold light of a Polish morning, the iron was being hammered into a new and terrible shape. The order was weapons-free. In the Mark 41 vertical launch system, the armored hatches flipped open with a metallic clang that was instantly swallowed by a roar that sounded like the sky was being torn in half. 16 cruise missiles erupted from the deck in a staggered, violent sequence, their solid fuel boosters punching through the overcast ceiling and leaving behind thick, white pillars of smoke that blotted out the bridge windows for several seconds. The heat blast from the launches was so intense, it blistered the gray paint on the nearby superstructure and sent a shimmering cloud of steam rising from the wet, salt-crusted deck. The vibration from the launches traveled through the steel of the ship, rattling the teeth of every sailor on board and shaking the very foundation of the peace they had been sworn to protect. 60 miles to the east, the missiles found their mark, a foreign military coastal radar site and a surface-to-air missile battery near the port facility. The first 3 cruise missiles slammed into the reinforced concrete command bunker, their 1,000-pound warheads detonating with a focused, kinetic force that sent 6-ton chunks of debris flying 500 meters into the surrounding sand dunes. The main radar dish, a masterpiece of foreign military engineering, was shredded by a storm of high-velocity shrapnel and then collapsed into a twisted, blackened heap of burning copper and steel. A secondary explosion from a nearby fuel bladder ignited, sending a sheet of liquid fire across the entire facility that turned the frozen ground into a lake of orange flame. The foreign military battery crews, caught in the middle of a frantic shift change, scrambled for cover that no longer existed. One technician attempted to reach a manual fire suppression handle in the communications van, but the pressure wave from the third impact threw him 30 meters against a jagged bulkhead, killing him instantly as the vehicle was flattened by the blast. In the nearby harbor, a foreign military corvette lurched violently as the shockwave hit its hull, its alarm systems wailing in a useless, high-pitched chorus as the crew fought to bring their own close-in weapon systems online against a second wave of missiles that were already screaming across the wavetops at 500 miles per hour. Black smoke, thick with the smell of burning rubber and high-grade diesel, began to tower over the coastal coast, a dark signal fire that was visible for 30 miles in every direction. The radar screen at the Foreign Military Regional Command Center in the coastal region went flatline, a digital void that signaled the total blinding of their northern flank. The silence that followed the impacts was more terrifying than the noise, a dead, heavy stillness where the only sound was the crackle of burning electronics and the distant, rhythmic crashing of the sea against the ruined pier. The retaliation was a clinical success, but in the context of war literature, it was a dark milestone in the collapse of human reason. The military forces had struck the foreign military mainland, and the foreign military mainland had bled. The Iron Horizon had moved again, shifting from a defensive line in Poland to a series of smoking craters on the coastal coast. Every sailor on the naval warship knew that the foreign military response would not be a diplomatic protest. It would be a kinetic escalation that would likely target the ship itself. As the destroyer turned hard to the west, its engines screaming at 30 knots to clear the expected counter-battery zone, the crew watched the horizon behind them. The pillars of smoke from the port facility stood like the columns of a ruined temple against the pale morning sky. There was no cheering on the bridge, no sense of triumph in the engine room. There was only a grim, hollow realization that they had just set fire to a house they were still standing in. The war was no longer about Poland. It was about the survival of the world as they knew it. and the price of that survival was being paid in fire and the lives of men who had never met. 7:45 in the morning. The freezing, pressurized cockpit of a Russian Tu-22M3 backfire bomber. The pilot's hand did not shake as he turned the key that authorized the release of 2 Kh-22 anti-ship missiles, his eyes fixed on a digital display that showed the heat signature of the destroyer USS Mason 50 miles to the west. The retaliation for the strike on Kaliningrad was not a matter of debate or tactical hesitation. It was a pre-programmed reflex of a military doctrine that viewed any attack on the motherland as an invitation to total, unrestricted violence. The air at 12,000 meters was a thin, crystalline blue, smelling of bottled oxygen and the faint ozone scent of high-altitude radiation, a stark and beautiful contrast to the carnage that was about to be unleashed on the water below. The escalation ladder had lost its bottom rungs, and the two superpowers were now climbing into a realm where the survivors would be those who struck first and struck with the most absolute brutality. In the strategic centers of Moscow, the loss of the radar site at Ballistic was being treated as the opening of a door that could only be closed with the sinking of an American capital ship. This was the dark philosophy of the proportional response, a logic that assumed the only way to stop a war was to make the cost of continuing it so high that the enemy's will to fight simply evaporated in a cloud of vaporized steel. The kinetic reckoning. The war had become a self-sustaining machine, an industrial process where the input was young lives and the output was a deepening, irreversible silence that threatened to consume the entire northern hemisphere. The sailors on the USS Mason, still exhausted from the Tomahawk launches, had less than 90 seconds to transition from the high of a successful mission to the terror of being the hunted. The Aegis combat system began to scream a warning that sounded like a funeral dirge. A series of high-pitched pulses that indicated multiple vampires were inbound at Mach 4. The trigger was squeezed. The massive Russian missile dropped from the centerline pylon of the bomber, falling for 2 seconds of dead weight before its liquid fuel rocket motor ignited. With a roar that vibrated through the bomber's titanium frame, a white column of fire punched backward through the thin air, leaving a trail of frozen chemical exhaust that stretched for miles across the Baltic horizon. The heat blast from the ignition was so intense it momentarily blinded the rear-facing cameras of the aircraft, while the sharp, acrid smell of unburned propellant drifted into the cockpit, a reminder of the raw, primitive power of the machine. The warhead punched through the destroyer's aluminum superstructure at 3 times the speed of sound, detonating deep within the ship's forward berthing compartments. The impact was so violent that the 6,000-ton vessel was shoved 5 meters to port, the steel plates of the hull buckling and shearing as if they were made of wet parchment. A fireball erupted from the center of the ship, a white-hot bloom of energy that bleached the surrounding fog and sent the primary radar mast tumbling into the sea in a tangle of broken dishes and shredded wire. The sound was not an explosion, but a tectonic crack that shattered every window within a mile and compressed the air into a physical wall of pressure. Inside the hull, the surviving sailors were thrown against the bulkheads by a shockwave that cracked eardrums and instantly shattered the light fixtures, plunging the compartments into a terrifying, flickering darkness. They did not scream. They gasped for air that was suddenly 300 degrees and thick with the smell of vaporized paint and burning hydraulic fluid. The automatic fire suppression systems hissed in a useless, stuttering rhythm as the deck beneath. Their feet began to tilt at a 15-degree angle, while the sound of the Baltic Sea roaring into the engine room through a hole the size of a transit van became the only rhythm left to follow. Black, oily smoke rose from the listing hull of the USS Mason, a dark smudge against the indifferent gray of the morning sea that looked like a mourning veil draped over the water. The burning ship was no longer a symbol of American power, but a floating testament to the lethal efficiency of a superpower that had been pushed beyond the limits of its patience. The Russian bombers banked hard to the east, their mission accomplished, leaving behind a graveyard of floating debris and the desperate, rhythmic splashing of men in orange life vests who were discovering that the sea was even colder than the war. The weight of the void. The geopolitical fallout of the sinking of an American destroyer was instantaneous and catastrophic. In Washington, the hawks who had argued for a limited engagement were silenced by the sheer scale of the loss, replaced by the grim, cold voices of those who demanded the total destruction of the Russian Northern Fleet. The conflict had moved past the stage of territorial disputes. It was now a matter of national honor, a primitive and unstoppable force that would demand thousands more lives before the first diplomat was allowed back into a room. The environment of the Baltic seemed to absorb the violence with a terrifying neutrality. The waves continued to crash against the jagged coast of Kaliningrad, and the wind continued to howl through the ruins of the radar station at Baltisк, indifferent to whether the smoke rising from the horizon was Russian or American. The Iron Horizon had become a circle, a loop of violence where every action triggered a reaction of equal or greater magnitude, leaving no room for the quiet voices of peace to be heard. The sun finally clearing the horizon 4 days into the war. The A2 motorway, stretching from the German border toward the heart of central Poland. The 3rd Expeditionary Sustainment Command was attempting to perform a logistical miracle under the shadow of a kinetic apocalypse. The German autobahns, once symbols of European efficiency and high-speed travel, had been transformed into a singular, gray artery of olive-drab steel, and the relentless, grinding vibration of 10,000 tires. For the logistics officers coordinating the flow, the war was not a map of tactical advances, but a desperate, mathematical struggle against the friction of distance and the terrifying consumption rates of high-intensity combat. The air along the transit corridor was a thick, suffocating fog of diesel smoke and the heavy, wet smell of churned mud that clung to every surface like a second skin. The Polish spring rain had turned the soft earth of the staging areas into a gelatinous slurry, a neutral enemy that clutched at the wheels of the 700 heavy expanded mobility tactical trucks surging toward the front. This was the Iron Flow, the hidden cardiovascular system of the Defense Alliance, and it was reaching the point of total cardiovascular collapse. The architecture of exhaustion. In the world of Style A3 war literature, the heroism of the front line is often overshadowed by the slow, agonizing exhaustion of the machine that feeds the fire. Every heavy battle tank crossing the strategic river required 500 liters of fuel every hour just to remain operational, a requirement that created a tail of supply vehicles, stretching back 300 kilometers. This was the logistics of attrition, a reality where a single foreign jet fighter aircraft slipping through the air defense screen to strike a fuel depot could paralyze an entire armored division more effectively than 1,000 anti-tank missiles. 5 days into the war, the Suwalki Gap, along the jagged, forested border between Poland and Lithuania. The tactical maps in both Washington and Moscow were now covered in a dense, overlapping lattice of red and blue icons that had not moved more than 5 kilometers in 48 hours. The high-speed, maneuver-based warfare that both superpowers had practiced for decades had ground to a shuddering, bloody halt against the reality of modern, high-intensity attrition. The Iron Horizon had become a static meat grinder, a line of fire and steel where the most advanced technology on the planet was being reduced to smoking scrap at a rate that defied all pre-war projections. The Polish landscape was no longer a place of rolling hills and quiet villages. It had been transformed into a lunar wasteland of cratered fields, splintered forests, and the skeletal remains of burnt-out towns. The air was a permanent, heavy shroud of pulverized concrete dust. The acrid stink of sulfur from millions of artillery rounds, and the sweet, sickening smell of decay that the freezing wind could no longer mask. This was the deadlock, a state of mutual exhaustion, where the industrial might of the world's 2 greatest powers was being poured into a narrow strip of land that was rapidly becoming a graveyard for an entire generation of men. The kinetic stalemate. The conflict had entered a phase where the individual was no longer a participant, but a raw material in an industrial process of slaughter. The 1st Armored Division and the Foreign Military 4th Guards Tank Division were currently locked in, a struggle for a single, nameless ridge that commanded a view of the main supply route. The engagement was a symphony of high-velocity kinetic energy, where the distance between life and death was measured in the milliseconds it took for a fire control computer to calculate a lead solution. The trigger was squeezed inside the cramped, humid turret of a heavy battle tank. The 120mm smoothbore gun barked with a deafening, metallic crash, the recoil rocking the 70-ton vehicle back into the deep, sucking mud of the Polish plain. A white-hot sabot round punched through the morning fog at 1,500 meters per second, striking a foreign military heavy battle tank directly on the turret ring. The impact was a blinding flash of white light that bleached the thermal optics of every vehicle in the sector. The foreign military tank's reactive armor erupted in a futile, secondary blast, but the kinetic penetrator drove straight through the steel, detonating the carousel of ammunition stored beneath the crew. The heavy battle tank did not just burn, it disintegrated. The 6-ton turret was launched 5 meters into the air by the internal explosion, falling back onto the hull with a bone-jarring thud that sent a shower of sparks into the dark tree line. But the victory was instantaneous and hollow. 3 seconds later, a foreign military anti-tank missile, launched from a hidden position in a ruined farmhouse, slammed into the side of the heavy battle tank. The shaped charge warhead punched a needle of molten copper through the thinner side armor, igniting the hydraulic fluid and filling the interior with a searing chemical fire. The armed personnel scrambled from the hatches, their uniforms alight, only to be cut down by the rhythmic, heavy thud of a foreign military 30mm autocannon firing from the shadows. The clearing was now a graveyard of blackened steel, where 4 of the most expensive and sophisticated machines ever built sat smoldering within 50 meters of one another. The smoke from the burning tanks rose in a single, thick column toward the gray sky, joining 1,000 other columns that marked the extent of the front. There was no follow-up charge, no breakthrough. There was only the heavy, rhythmic thrum of distant artillery as both sides settled back into their muddy holes to wait for the next wave of targets to appear on their screens. The philosophy of the void. The geopolitical reality of the 5th day was a suffocating realization of futility. In the high-security bunkers of the Defense Headquarters facility, the analysts were staring at data that showed the military had lost more tanks in 5 days than it had in the entire decade of the Iraq War. In the intelligence facility, the reports were even worse, indicating that the elite tank regiments that were supposed to be the vanguard of the foreign state were being hollowed out at a rate of 1 battalion every 12 hours. The war was no longer about territory or influence or the Suwalki Gap. It was a self-sustaining cycle of destruction that neither side knew how to stop without admitting total defeat. The Iron Horizon had become a mirror, reflecting the same grim, exhausted face back at both protagonists. The soldiers on the ground were reaching the limits of human endurance, their skin gray from lack of sleep, and their minds fractured by the constant, high-vibration stress of the incoming alarms. They lived in a world where the future did not exist beyond the next 30 minutes, a world where the only truth was the cold weight of the rifle and the smell of the wet ash. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the cratered earth, the silence of the stalemate returned to the ridge. The wind howled through the twisted metal of the burnt-out tanks, a hollow, mournful sound that seemed to ask why any of it had begun. There was no winner on the 5th day, only a deeper, darker understanding of the price of superpower pride. The war had become a dead weight, dragging both nations toward a future where the only thing left to count would be the number of graves. 11 days into the war, the strategic command center beneath the Appalachian Mountains and the reinforced bunkers of the Russian General Staff. The global order, a complex and fragile lattice of trade, digital exchange, and mutual deterrence that had defined the human experience for 80 years was not merely cracking, it was being systematically dismantled. The strategic analysts, sitting in rooms where the air was heavy with the smell of scorched ozone and the dry, metallic scent of overheated servers, looked at maps that no longer represented a world of sovereign nations. Instead, they saw a collection of fortified islands, separated by vast no-go zones where the most advanced satellites and sensors on the planet were being blinded by high-powered laser arrays and kinetic interceptors. This was the Great Decoupling, a moment where the integrated global economy died in the fire of a 1,000-kilometer front in Eastern Europe. In the world of Style A3 war literature, the tragedy is not found in the loss of territory, but in the loss of the future. The Iron Horizon had become a ceiling, trapping the two most powerful civilizations in history in a room with no exits and no air. Every calculation made by the grand strategists over the last decade, the game theory, the escalation modeling, the red lines had been proven to be a collective delusion, a house of cards that collapsed. The moment the first Iskander-M missile left its rail, the blinding of the orbital layer, the war had extended beyond the mud of the Suwalki Gap and into the cold, silent vacuum of low Earth orbit. The United States Space Force and the Russian Aerospace Forces were currently engaged in a frantic, invisible struggle to decapitate the other's eye in the sky. The Kessler Syndrome, once a theoretical nightmare of orbital debris, was becoming a physical reality as anti-satellite missiles shattered high-value reconnaissance platforms into thousands of jagged, hypervelocity fragments. The Global Positioning System, the GPS network that guided everything from cruise missiles to civilian delivery trucks, was flickering like a dying light bulb, its signals saturated with sophisticated spoofing data that made the very concept of location a matter of opinion. The pilots of the jet fighter aircraft and the jet fighter aircraft were now flying blind, forced to rely on inertial navigation and paper maps, returning to a primitive form of aerial combat that their grandfathers would have recognized. The air war had become a series of black box engagements, where entire squadrons vanished into the radar blind zones of the Polish border, their fates known only to the cold, indifferent stars. The Pacific Rift. While the iron was being hammered in Europe, the strategic analysis was shifting toward the second front in the Pacific. The People's Liberation Army Navy had moved 3 carrier strike groups into the Philippine Sea. Their presence, a silent, heavy question mark that Washington could no longer afford to ignore. The United States Indo-Pacific Command was being forced to choose between reinforcing the bleeding front in Poland or holding the line against a foreign hegemon that viewed the European conflict as a golden opportunity to settle its own historical debts. The world was no longer a chessboard. It was a spinning coin, and it was landing on its edge. In the Persian Gulf, the Foreign Military Revolutionary Guard had mined the Strait of Hormuz, causing global oil prices to quadruple in 48 hours, an economic shockwave that was causing the collapse of financial markets from Tokyo to London. The Iron Horizon was now a global fracture, a crack in the foundation of the world that was leaking the heat of a dozen different regional fires. The failure of deterrence. The most terrifying realization of the 11th day was the total failure of conventional deterrence. The escalation ladder had not stopped the violence. It had merely provided the blueprints for its expansion. Both Moscow and Washington were now trapped in a sunk-cost fallacy of civilizational proportions, where the tens of thousands of lives already lost were used as the primary justification for losing tens of thousands more. Neither side could blink, because to blink was to admit that the last 80 years of military spending and national pride had been a catastrophic waste. Inside the command bunkers, the generals spoke in hushed, mechanical tones about tactical nuclear thresholds and acceptable loss ratios, the language of human reason being used to plan the end of the human story. They were no longer fighting for a bridge or a ridge. They were fighting for the survival of their respective ideologies, and in that struggle, the Iron Horizon offered no room for compromise. The environment of the strategic centers reflected this grim reality. The lights were dimmed to save power, the coffee was bitter and cold, and the only sound was the rhythmic, hollow tapping of fingers on keyboards as they calculated the next move in a game that no one could win. As the sun set over the Appalachian Mountains, casting long, dark shadows across the entrance to the command bunkers, the realization began to sink in that there would be no victory day for this conflict. There would only be the dead silence that follows the final reload. The iron horizon had closed, and behind it, the world was becoming a darker, colder, and much more silent place. The machines of war would continue to grind because they had been built to do nothing else, and the men who controlled them had forgotten how to say stop. 21 days into the war. The Suwalki Gap and the scorched remains of the Polish-Belarusian border. The iron horizon was no longer a moving line. It had become a permanent, jagged scar of black earth and twisted metal that stretched from the Baltic Sea to the marshes of the south. The high-velocity maneuvers of the first week had been replaced by a heavy, soul-crushing stasis, as two exhausted superpowers collapsed into the mud of their own making. The air over the front was a thick, stagnant soup of wood smoke from burning forests, the chemical bite of lingering white phosphorus, and the cold, indifferent dampness of a Polish spring that refused to arrive. For the 50,000 American soldiers and their counterparts in the Russian ground forces, the war had ceased to be about ideology or national interest. It had become a primitive struggle for warmth, for dry socks, and for the next 30 minutes of life. The Style A3 war literature of this era would record no grand victories or heroic charges into the heart of the enemy. It would only record the slow, rhythmic grinding of two massive machines that had run out of fuel but refused to stop their gears from turning. The architecture of the stalemate. The strategic reality of the 21st day was a monumental, silent exhaustion. The high-tech arsenals, the F-35 Bravo fighters, the S-400 missile systems, and the Aegis destroyers had largely been consumed, or rendered useless by the total collapse of the global sensor grid. The orbital layer was now a cloud of hypervelocity trash, and the digital networks were a sea of white noise. The war had regressed through the decades, stripping away the silicon and the light until only the steel and the mud remained. Soldiers in the Suwalki Gap were now fighting with weapons their grandfathers would have found familiar, unleashing barrages of dumb iron bombs and unguided artillery shells, because the precision-guided smart munitions were a memory of a lost civilization. The Iron Horizon was a landscape of deep, waterlogged trenches and fortified cellars, where the only thing moving was the gray smoke and the occasional, desperate patrol of men whose eyes were hollowed out by 3 weeks of sensory overload. This was the deadlock, a piece of the graveyard where neither side had the strength to win and neither side had the political courage to lose. The geopolitical void. In the capitals of Washington and Moscow, the atmosphere was one of grim, claustrophobic isolation. The globalized world of 80 years had evaporated, replaced by a series of closed, paranoid societies where the only industry was the production of more shells and more coffins. The great decoupling was complete. The trade routes were severed. The internet was a fractured collection of national firewalls, and the very concept of the West or Greater Russia had been reduced to a desperate, internal survival instinct. There was no talk of peace treaties or diplomatic summits because there was no one left to trust. The philosophical close. The environment of the Polish plains seemed to be reclaiming the battlefield with a terrifying, natural indifference. The craters were filling with rainwater, the splintered trees were beginning to push out small, sickly buds of green, and the birds were returning to a landscape where the primary sound was no longer the roar of the jet engine, but the rhythmic, distant thud of a lone sniper's rifle. Nature did not care about the Suwalki Protocol or the red lines of the Kremlin. It only cared about the cycle of the seasons, a cycle that would continue long after the last tank had rusted into the earth. The Iron Horizon was the final lesson of the 21st century, a lesson that deterrence only works as long as both sides are afraid of the fire, and that once the fire starts, it consumes the fear along with everything else. The soldiers sitting in the mud near Rexau looked toward the east and saw only the same gray sky that the Russian soldiers saw looking toward the west. They were the ghosts of a world that had forgotten how to talk, trapped in the dead silence between reloads. The war had not settled the question of who was right. It had only settled the question of who was left. As the sun set for the 21st time since the first Iskander-M missile had been launched, casting long, distorted shadows across a continent of ruins, the realization finally took hold. This was not the end of the war, and it was not the beginning of peace. It was simply the end of the world as they knew it, a world that had been traded for a line of smoke on a cold horizon.